Great, thank you. So it's appropriate, the last talk before lunch, I'll talk about the misuse of stimulant medications and try to get us through quickly. So they're the two titles of my talk. A little bit different perspective on the self-treatment issue than Sean described, and I'll present some data relevant to that. And the second part of my talk is really, is there more going on here than just work hard, play hard, which is oftentimes how this is conveyed. So I would bet that almost every day in this country, some newspaper somewhere has a story about college students engaged in the non-medical use of stimulant medications. Those are just a few of the recent headlines that I got off of Google the other day. Anybody see a couple of weeks ago, 60 Minutes had a lead story on the misuse of stimulant medications on college campuses. And so first question is why should we be concerned about this? I mean, obviously, alcohol misuse is such a large problem among college students. How large of an issue is the misuse of ADHD meds? And Sean did a great job of highlighting some of the reasons to be concerned about this. I just have a few highlights up there. Every year, there are thousands of college-age individuals who meet criteria for stimulant abuse or stimulant dependence. The non-medical use of stimulant medications results in thousands of visits to emergency rooms around the country each year. As we just heard, many students use these drugs non-medically along with alcohol and other substances, which really increases the risk of harmful effects. And then there are many people, including students, who regard the non-medical use of things like Adderall and Concerta as cheating. There was an editorial in the student newspaper at Duke a couple of years ago about this as really cheating behavior and a violation of the honor code. So what do we know about this behavior from the popular press? Generally speaking, what you see in the press is that students are doing this really for two main reasons: to sort of gain an academic edge and to be able to sort of party longer and party harder. And that the way that this is often portrayed in the media, even very responsible outlets like The New Yorker and 60 Minutes, is that this is really all part of the work hard, play hard lifestyle, and that there's not much more to it than that. And those of you who may have seen the 60 Minutes piece a couple of weeks ago, in my view, that was entirely how this was presented. They had, it was described as this is very normative behavior among students. Students do it to get better grades. They do it in order to be able to, again, to party longer after they've been studying, for many hours. At University of Kentucky, which is where the students on the 60 Minutes piece were from, they reported that 34% of the undergrads had engaged in non-medical use since beginning college. And again, it was all just part of this work hard, play hard student lifestyle. What do we know from the research? I'll go through this quickly. Sean summarized much of this. As he said, there's a wide range of variation across campuses in the rates of non-medical use that students report. As he said, non-medical use tends to be higher at more competitive schools, and it tends to be associated with a variety of demographic characteristics. It's higher among white students, among students in the Greek system. Students who engage in this behavior, on average, have lower GPAs and higher rates of other substance use. And then kind of the second generation of studies that was also done by Sean and his colleagues, for the most part, began to look at the motives, why students report doing this. And what you can see is the most commonly reported motives have to do with reasons of academic enhancement, to help with studying, to help with concentration, to get high. And then there were some important questions we felt that remained from these initial studies. So a lot of several of the studies, they just looked at the questions would be along the lines of, have you ever engaged in non-medical use since beginning college? So we really didn't necessarily have a good handle on the frequency with which students were using. So in some of these studies, a student who used it once in 4 years would be treated equivalently as somebody who might be doing it 10 or 20 times a semester. When they ask students about, when students were asked about the reasons for non-medical use, oftentimes they were just asked to check any reason that had ever applied. So you didn't have really a good sense of the relative strength of the different motives that students might engage in this. We had very little information coming from directly asking students about what the impact on them that they perceived non-medical use to have. And then what we were particularly interested in was the notion that are there students who are really out there engaging in non-medical use of ADHD drugs, not so much to enhance their performance, to be kind of super students, to really be able to do the work hard, play hard, even harder and longer, but were some students really looking to these meds to really try to overcome deficits that they experience as undermining their ability to succeed in college, as opposed to sort of be super students. So we started a study about 4 years ago. It was done here at Duke and at UNC in Greensboro. They're my collaborators on the study, including Sean. The study was funded by NIDA, and we had just absolutely fabulous help from the Office of Institutional Research here at Duke, David Jamison Drake and his colleagues. And design of the study, in the first year, roughly 10 weeks into the students' first semester, we sent invitations by email to every single freshman at Duke and UNCG who was older than 18 and requested that they participate. And then in the second year, in the spring semester of the following year, we tried to get a second wave of data on all of those former freshmen who were now presumably second semester sophomores. And then we also took a random 50% of the remaining 3 classes. So we wound up with both a longitudinal sample that consisted of 843 students that we surveyed, again, roughly 10 weeks into their arriving on campus, and then about a year and a half later, and a cross-sectional sample that had over 3,400 students. And like Sean's work, this was all done using a web-based survey where students were promised complete confidentiality and essentially anonymity of their responses. We looked at a variety of different things. For students who reported the non-medical use, we tried to nail down how frequently they were engaging in that behavior. And then we asked about the importance of a variety of both academic and non-academic motives for their use. So for a variety of different motives, we asked them to rate on a 1 to 5 scale whether that was either never a reason that they used or always a reason that they used. And then we also asked what consequences they perceived of their non-medical use. And we asked in a similar way to rate on a 1 to 5 scale whether the non-medical use of ADHD drugs never produced a particular effect or whether they felt it always produced that effect. And in addition to those things, we asked students about some of the side effects that they experienced. We asked about their non-medical use of other prescription drugs. We asked about use of alcohol and other substances. And then what was, for me, the most interesting part of the study is we asked them to report on their own attention difficulties and problems related to hyperactive and impulsive behavior. And these were not DSM-IV symptoms of ADHD. We really tried to frame questions about, say, attention difficulties that would be particularly meaningful to college students. So those were things like, I'm not able to focus in my classes as other students. They would rate that on a 1 to 5 scale, whether they strongly disagreed or strongly agreed with that. I'm not able to study for as long a period of time as my classmates. Attention difficulties keep me from doing as well in my classes as I think I should be able to. We also asked them about academic concerns, how confident they were about being able to succeed academically, how satisfied they were with the grades that they were getting, how they were doing in their classes. And then we also asked them to report on depressive symptoms. So this is just some of the basic prevalence data. This is from the cross-sectional sample, so this included all 4 years. And we found that in our sample, and this is about 1,700 kids at Duke and an equal number at UNCG, we get nearly the response rates that, Sean, you have to tell me how you managed to get 68%. So we found about 9% had reported engaging in non-medical use at some point since starting college. The use in the last 6 months was lower, down at about 5.5%. And the degree to which this increased over the course of students' year in school was really quite striking. At Duke in particular, we went from less than 2% of the freshmen to over 20% of the seniors. So that's a tenfold increase during their time at school. At UNCG, it was a very similar pattern, but not quite as pronounced. So how often do students use? We asked, among those who are non-medical users, we asked them how frequently they had used in the past 6 months. And the important point here is that you can see that there is a meaningful subgroup of non-medical users who are doing this fairly often. So we had nearly 20% who reported using at least 10 times during the prior 6 months. So again, the majority is just a time or two, but there is a meaningful chunk of kids who are doing this fairly routinely. And then as far as who the non-medical users are, not that much of a difference between males and females. As Sean's found in several of his other studies, much more common among white students than other students. No big surprise here, more common among students in the Greek system than non-Greeks. And then, this is kind of the first sort of bit of data in our study that suggests that it's just not normative behavior as was portrayed on 60 Minutes. So among the non-medical users, 25% had also used cocaine in the past 6 months, compared to only 2% of the non-medical users. Even a sort of similar spread for marijuana. And then, again, these are not just sort of happy, successful students. On average, they had lower grade point averages, and they reported more concerns about their academic performance. Where do they get the meds? This really echoes Sean's data. These percentages add up to more than 100% because we asked students to tell us any source that they had ever gotten from. As you can see, the majority are getting it from other kids with prescriptions, and that really sort of echoes Sean's point about the need, if you want to try to prevent this behavior on campus, really sort of targeting the kids with prescriptions and telling them that's probably not the best idea to be giving your medication away. But at least in our, whoops, oh, sorry about that. In our sample, what you can see is probably there's some overlap between these two, but about 30% are getting it from other students who don't have a prescription. So, there is some non-trivial, I don't know the numbers, but there's some cadre of students on our campuses that shouldn't have the meds in the first place and are then sort of passing it, passing it along to others. Very few report getting the medication by stealing it, which is good. Why do students use? So we sort of collapsed this 1 to 5 scale into students who reported that a given motive was either rarely or never a reason for use, sometimes a reason, or often or always a reason. And what you can see is that the two biggies have to do with enhancing the ability to study. To be able to concentrate better while studying, to be able to study longer. So, close to 50% or more report that when they use, that's either often or always the reason why they engage in non-medical use. And for whatever, they're not taking it frequently to be able to concentrate better in class. That was a much less common motive. And then when you start to look at some of these non-academic enhancing reasons for use, what you can see is there are very, very few kids for whom that's a frequent motive. I mean, there are not a there's a meaningful chunk of kids who are doing that. That's an occasional motive for use. But as far as what is the most frequent source of their motivation, there are really very few students for whom reasons that don't pertain to academic enhancement, particularly enhancing the ability to study outside of class, is an important reason. Now, the good news or the bad news, depending on your perspective, is when we ask students whether or not non-medical use is having the impact that they want, they overwhelmingly report that it is. So when you ask them, when you take this to be able to concentrate better while studying, how often does it produce the desired effect? Well, close to 90% tell us that it either often or always produces the effect that they want. To study longer, similar results. To feel less restless, similar results. For students who say that they use to get high, nearly 60% report that it often or always gets them high. Now, I don't have any idea whether or not that's actually true, but they certainly think that it is. And then in terms of adverse effects, what you can see, these are the percentage of non-medical users who reported these kinds of side effects happening at least occasionally. And what's interesting about this is that these are higher than what you would see on the package inserts for Adderall, Concerta, Ritalin. So, sleep problems. Now, that probably may have a lot to do with when they're taking it, which is probably 11 or 12 at night. Irritability, 45% report that they experience irritability as a result of their non-medical use. And then more serious potential side effects. 5% feel that as a result of their non-medical use of ADHD drugs, it contributed to their non-prescription use of other prescription drugs, as well as to the use of other illicit substances. This is kind of a depressing statistic, I think, that 40% of our non-medical users reported feeling that they need ADHD meds to do their best academically. I mean, that's not the kind of attribution that you would like a lot of your students to be walking around campus with. And nearly 10% of non-medical users report worrying about becoming dependent on the drug. And they have good reason to worry. You saw from Sean's talk earlier that there's a meaningful percentage of kids who do become dependent. And then this was really kind of striking to me. We asked students to rate on a 1 to 5 scale the overall impact on them that non-medical use of ADHD drugs had. And despite the reasonably large percentage who were reporting adverse effects, 70% said it was either positive or very positive. And only 5% felt that overall the impact on them had been negative. And the more frequently students used, the more convinced they were that the overall effect on them was positive. So they really believe it works. They really think that this is it's a winner for them. Okay, so now this is the part of the data that was of most interest to me. We really wanted to look at what the association is between students' reports of ADHD symptoms and being a non-medical user. So these numbers up here represent standard scores. So they would have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. And you can see that for self-reported attention problems, and again, those were questions like, I can't concentrate in class as well as my peers. Attention difficulties are keeping me from being as successful as I could be. You can see that the non-medical users are about 0.6 of a standard deviation higher than the non-users. So that's a decent-sized effect. Similar kind of difference for self-reported difficulties with hyperactive and impulsive behavior. When it comes to depression, when it comes to depression, no difference at all. And then we also, in our sample, asked students whether they had a current diagnosis for ADHD, medical diagnosis. And what we found was that 25% of the non-medical users reported levels of ADHD symptoms that were at or above the median of the group that reported an actual diagnosis. Now, that doesn't in any way mean that these kids all had ADHD. There are lots of reasons why students can struggle with attention, sleep problems, depression, anxiety. But the point is that many of them are reporting rates of symptoms in that area that are consistent with their ADHD peers. This is the result of an analysis where we were essentially looking at the degree to which ADHD symptoms predicted whether or not students would be a non-medical user or not. And so these represent odds ratios. And this is sort of controlling for race, for gender, for whether or not they were in the Greek system, for their level of substance use, and whether they were Duke or UNCG students. And you can see that students who were high for attention problems, so these are kids who are standard deviation above the sample mean for self-reported attention difficulties, they were nearly twice as likely to be in the non-medical use group than were their peers. Interestingly, inattention had no predictive effect as to whether or not they abused or misused other prescription drugs. But hyperactivity and self-reported depression, those had no predictive value in terms of whether or not a kid was going to be a non-medical user of ADHD drugs, but it did increase the odds of using other prescription drugs. Both hyperactivity and depression did that. So what this sort of starts to suggest is that the non-medical use of ADHD meds seems to be uniquely associated with students' experience of their own attention difficulties. And then this is what I would say is additional evidence for this kind of self-treatment idea. This was a recently published study, small sample, convenience sample. It was done at George Mason. They surveyed 184 students. They had those students complete the World Health Organization ADHD self-report scale, which is a pretty decent screening instrument. And they also asked about their non-medical use of ADHD drugs. And in this sample, 25% of those students reported non-medical use. And of those 25%, 71% screened positive on this measure for ADHD. The non-medical users were 7 times more likely to screen positive than were the non-users. 76% believe that non-medical use resulted in better grades. So going back to Sean's point about the differences between campuses, it may be that the association between at least self-reported ADHD symptoms and non-medical use may also vary quite a bit from campus to campus. Then I'm going to end by talking about sort of the longitudinal sample. And this was kind of a neat part of the study. We had data from about 8 to 10 weeks into students' first semester. And what we looked at among these, the 843 students who we also had the same survey data a year and a half later, is who became a non-medical user during that time. And there were 45 students, about 5.4% of the sample, who reported the onset of non-medical use between the beginning of their freshman year and the latter part of their sophomore year. And we looked at what predicted the onset of non-medical use. So white students were twice as likely to become non-medical users. Students in the Greek system, twice as likely. Students who were high on substance use, so students who were standard deviation above the mean as first semester freshmen on a variety of substance use items, were 4 times as likely. So that's the biggest risk factor. But then we also find that the amount of attention difficulties that students reported 2 months after they showed up on campus nearly doubled the odds of their becoming a non-medical user. And if you looked at specifically at those students who were not also high substance users, students who reported high rates of attention problems were actually 7 times more likely than other students to become non-medical users. And again, the onset of non-medical use of ADHD drugs, it wasn't predicted by self-reported depression at that time. It wasn't predicted by the amount of hyperactive impulsive behavior students reported. So again, it looked like a specific effect of inattention. And then this was some subgrouping work that we did, kind of similar to a little different scheme than Sean talked about. These are the kids who became non-medical users between the two waves of the survey. We had 11 of those kids had high rates of attention problems. So they were our kids who are standard deviation above the mean on self-reported attention difficulties. 24 who became non-medical users were high on substance use. And then we had 10 kids who weren't high on either of those. They were within the normative range. And this just looks at characteristics of these three groups of students who initiated non-medical use by GPA, by the amount of academic concerns that they expressed both at the beginning of freshman year and a year and a half later, as well as their self-reported depression. These are all standard scores. Again, mean of 0, standard deviation of 1. So you can see the students who became non-medical users who were initially high on attention problems, by the time they were roughly halfway through college, they had substantially lower GPAs than their peers. Between year 1 and year 2, their level of academic concerns had increased significantly, so it was now quite a bit higher than other kids. And at both time points, they reported higher rates of depression. The students who became non-medical users who were high on substance use initially, they really don't look different on any of these dimensions. And then the kids who became non-medical users who weren't highly inattentive or high substance users to begin with, they also look pretty much like the rest of the population. So conclusions. Number one, non-medical use of ADHD drugs, it's fairly common. It increases significantly across college. Students are using primarily to enhance their ability to study. They're quite certain that it's helpful. We think that the two important subgroups are high substance users for whom using ADHD drugs may just be kind of experimenting with another substance that's very easy to get on campuses. But then the other group of interest are students who really report high rates of attention difficulties and who worry about their ability to succeed academically. Some students, we think, this data suggests that there really are some students who do turn to ADHD meds to treat themselves, that for these kids it really is quite a bit more than work hard, play hard. In terms of prevention, probably the most important thing would be to target those kids who have the prescriptions and keep them from diverting. And that's a relatively small sample. In our study, we only had about 2.5% of the sample who reported having a prescription. And then educating students who feel like they're struggling with attention to pursue a more appropriate way of dealing with that than getting meds from their peer. I mean, there's a way in which students knocking on their friend's door for ADHD meds to deal with their attention difficulties is about as appropriate as students who drink to deal with their depressive symptoms. It's no more likely to be effective. And I think one of the most important negative consequences of this is that for students who truly have ADHD, who are then, as a result of access to drugs on a PRN basis, prevents them from getting appropriate evaluation and treatment, there's a real good chance that they wind up bombing out of school because they're not getting appropriate treatment, they're not getting any kinds of accommodations that they might be entitled to. And there's a disconnect here, and that's that many college counseling centers will not provide any kind of evaluation or treatment services for ADHD. At Duke, in CAPS, there are psychiatrists who will prescribe antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, but you can't get prescriptions for ADHD medications on our campus. My understanding is that's true at a lot of campuses because not wanting to deal with these controlled substances. And to the extent that a student has to go into a community setting to make an appointment, drive off campus to get medication, it may be just that much easier to say I can get it when I need it down the hall. And then finally, in terms of some important unanswered questions, does the non-medical use of these drugs really help? Students are convinced that it is. I'd be amazed, actually, if it does help. Because presumably what they really want the help for is to get better grades. And we don't find any evidence in our sample that among students with prescriptions that it makes any difference in their grades. And there's really very limited evidence in the whole literature that ADHD medication is associated with any kind of better academic achievement. So the likelihood that taking this, every now and then before an exam or even more regularly is actually going to boost their GPA in any meaningful way, I think is very, very slim. But a study like that should be done. There's essentially no data on that. And then second unanswered question is really how, given all the issues related to alcohol and other substances that college counselors and deans and student affairs folks have to deal with on their campus, just how significant are the adverse consequences of this? And that would really require following a cohort of kids over their 4 years and beyond. And we haven't been able to do that work. Maybe that's something that Sean is doing. So thank you.